The industrial staples lay scattered across the concrete floor like silver confetti, each one reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of Riverside High's workshop classroom. Dylan Carter sprawled against the brick wall, his designer polo shirt. Torn and bloodied, 3 metal staples still embedded in the mortar where his head had been moments before. His perfectly styled blonde hair now hung in sweaty strands across his face as he stared up at Ethan Miller with eyes that held something between terror and recognition. Ethan stood motionless in the center of the chaos, his grandfather's vintage military jacket hanging in tatters around his shoulders. The fabric that had survived Vietnam, CIA operations across 3 continents, and 40 years of careful preservation had been destroyed in seconds by a gang of entitled bullies who thought violence was a game. But the jacket's destruction had revealed something Dylan never expected to see. Something that connected their families in ways that made tonight's violence feel like destiny rather than coincidence. Blood dripped steadily from Dylan's split lip as he whispered the same words over and over, his voice cracking with each repetition. "You're supposed to be dead. You're all supposed to be dead." The workshop tools that had been scattered during the fight seemed to glisten with an ominous promise, and everyone who witnessed what happened in this room would remember exactly how the senator's golden boy ended up broken against the wall, defeated by a quiet transfer student who moved like death itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 hours earlier, Ethan Miller had stood before his bedroom mirror, running his fingers along the worn leather patches of his grandfather's combat jacket. The apartment he shared with his grandmother Rose was small and sparse, decorated only with faded photographs of soldiers and a Purple Heart display case that caught the morning light. Rose's weathered hands shook slightly as she helped him adjust the jacket's shoulders, her fingers tracing bullet holes that had been carefully mended with military precision. "This jacket has protected 3 generations of Miller men," Rose whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent keeping secrets. "Your grandfather wore it through Saigon, your father through Baghdad, and now it's yours to carry forward." She paused at the zipper, revealing a hidden pocket that contained documents Ethan had never seen before. "But protection isn't just about what you wear, sweetheart. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to keep others safe." Ethan nodded silently, understanding that this wasn't just about starting at a new school. 6 months had passed since the car accident that claimed his parents. 6 months since Rose had pulled him from his grief and begun teaching him the skills his father never wanted him to learn. The Krav Maga sessions in the basement, the tactical awareness training, the weapons handling that felt more like meditation than combat preparation. Everything his grandmother taught him came with stories about his grandfather's work with the agency, about enemies who never forgot, and vengeance that could span generations. His phone buzzed against the dresser. A text from Maya Rodriguez, the only student at Riverside High who had bothered speaking to him during his first week. "Be careful today. Dylan's crew is planning something big. Someone leaked that you're living with your grandmother because your parents are gone. They think you're an easy target." Ethan smiled grimly, slipping the phone into his jacket pocket next to his grandfather's tactical pen. Let them think what they wanted. He'd learned long ago that underestimation was often the most powerful weapon in his arsenal. Rose gripped his shoulders with surprising strength. "Your father tried to live a normal life, tried to pretend the past wouldn't follow him. Look where that got him." Her eyes hardened with a pain that never fully healed. "The Carters have been untouchable for too long, protected by money and political connections while good people suffer in silence. Today might be the day that changes." The drive to Riverside High took them through Millbrook County's most affluent neighborhoods, past mansions that spoke of old money and older secrets. Rose's ancient Honda looked out of place among the luxury sedans and sports cars that dominated the school parking lot. But Ethan had long since stopped caring about appearances. Wealth meant nothing when you'd learned to kill with household objects before your 18th birthday. The school itself was a monument to privilege, funded by donations from families like the Carters, who expected their children to rule without consequence. Ethan walked through hallways lined with trophy cases and honor roll placements, noting how students instinctively moved aside when they saw him coming. Not from respect, but from the kind of primal recognition that occurred when prey sensed a predator in their midst. He found Maya waiting by his locker, her expression tense with worry. She was one of the few scholarship students at Riverside, brilliant enough to earn her place, but too honest to play the political games that kept her safe from Dylan's attention. "They're waiting for you in Peterson's workshop class," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "Connor Hayes told me Dylan's been carrying a staple gun all morning, talking about how transfer students need to learn their place in the social hierarchy." Ethan opened his locker with mechanical precision, noting how his hands remained completely steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "How many of them?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the fear Maya expected from someone about to face down the school's most vicious bullies. "7, maybe 8. Brandon Woods is definitely there, and probably Jake Morrison and Tyler Cross. They've been planning this since yesterday, ever since someone told Dylan your parents died in a car crash and you're living on charity." Maya's voice cracked slightly. "Ethan, these aren't just school bullies. Dylan's father is Senator Carter. They've made kids disappear before, transferred schools, moved away, worse things that nobody talks about." Ethan closed his locker with a soft click that somehow sounded final in the empty hallway. He turned to face Maya with eyes that held depth she couldn't begin to comprehend, eyes that had seen things no 17-year-old should ever witness. "Maya, I need you to do something for me. When this is over, when Dylan and his crew are lying on that workshop floor, I need you to make sure everyone knows exactly what happened and why. Can you do that?" The bell rang, echoing through corridors. That would soon witness something Riverside High had never seen before. The workshop classroom smelled of sawdust and machine oil, a familiar scent that reminded Ethan of his grandfather's garage, where Rose had first taught him that ordinary tools could become extraordinary weapons in the right hands. Industrial workbenches lined the room in perfect rows, each equipped with vices, sanders, and power tools that hummed with barely contained energy. The afternoon sun streamed through safety glass windows, casting long shadows across concrete floors that would soon be marked with more than just wood shavings and metal filings. Mr. Peterson stood at the front of the room, completely oblivious to the predatory tension that crackled in the air like static electricity before a thunderstorm. He was explaining proper safety procedures for the bandsaw, his voice droning on about protective eyewear and maintaining proper distance from moving blades. But Ethan's attention was focused entirely on the 8 figures clustered around the workbench in the far corner, their body language speaking a language of planned violence that required no translation. Dylan Carter leaned against the table saw with practiced arrogance, his designer jeans and polo shirt looking absurdly out of place in an environment designed for actual work. Even in shop class, he managed to project the kind of effortless superiority that came from knowing Daddy's money could solve any problem and Daddy's political connections could make any witness disappear. His sandy hair caught the light perfectly, styled with the kind of expensive products that cost more than most families spent on groceries. Everything about him screamed untouchable privilege, from his custom sneakers to the Rolex that glinted on his wrist. Brandon Woods flanked Dylan's right side like a loyal attack dog, his massive frame straining against a football jersey that displayed his varsity status like a badge of authority. Brandon had the kind of muscles that came from steroids and protein shakes rather than actual hard work, but his reputation for violence was well earned. 3 assault charges had disappeared from his record thanks to the Carter family's legal team. And everyone at Riverside knew that crossing Brandon meant hospital, visits, and mysterious accidents. Connor Hayes stood slightly apart from the main group, his nervous energy betraying an intelligence that set him apart from Dylan's usual collection of muscle-bound enforcers. Connor's father owned the largest construction company in Millbrook County, making him valuable enough to earn a place in the inner circle, despite his obvious discomfort with their methods. His fingers drummed against the workbench in an anxious rhythm that suggested he understood exactly how wrong this was about to go. Jake Morrison and Tyler Cross completed the core group, both of them radiating the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of never facing consequences for their actions. Jake's father was the county prosecutor, while Tyler's mother sat on the school board. They were princes in a kingdom built on corruption and silence, protected by a network of adults who valued political favor over basic human decency. 3 additional figures lurked at the edges of the group, underclassmen desperate for acceptance who would do anything to earn a place among the powerful. Their names didn't matter to Dylan, who viewed them as disposable tools to be used and discarded as needed. But Ethan catalogued each face with the methodical precision his grandmother had taught him, understanding that in the chaos about to unfold, even the least significant player could become a critical threat. The industrial staple gun sat prominently on Dylan's workbench, its chrome surface reflecting the fluorescent lights like a promise of pain. It was a heavy-duty model designed for construction work, capable of driving 3-inch staples through hardwood with enough force to penetrate bone. Dylan's fingers so traced its outline with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for Christmas morning, his smile growing wider as Ethan approached the only available workstation. "Well, well," Dylan announced loudly enough for the entire class to hear. "Looks like the charity case finally decided to join us productive members of society." His voice carried the particular tone of someone who had never worked a day in his life but somehow felt qualified to judge others based on their economic status. "I was beginning to think you were too scared to show up for real class, where we actually build things instead of just taking handouts." Ethan set his backpack down with deliberate calm, his movements controlled and economical in a way that spoke of extensive training. He began removing his tools from their case with the kind of methodical precision that made several students pause in their own work to watch. Each implement was perfectly maintained, arranged in order of size and function, handled with the respect due to instruments that could save lives or end them depending on the wielder's intent. "Interesting collection," Mr. Peterson observed, wandering over to examine Ethan's equipment. "These are professional-grade tools, not the usual student kit. Where did you learn to maintain them so well?" His question was innocent enough, but Ethan could feel Dylan's attention sharpen like a blade being honed against stone. "My grandfather taught me that tools are only as good as the person caring for them," Ethan replied quietly, his voice carrying none of the defensiveness Dylan expected. He believed that sloppy maintenance led to sloppy work, and sloppy work got people killed. The casual reference to death made several students exchange glances, uncertain whether he was speaking metaphorically or from personal experience. Dylan's laugh was sharp and mocking, designed to establish dominance through public humiliation. "Oh, we've got ourselves a philosopher here, boys. Tell me, transfer student, did your grandfather also teach you that begging for charity makes you a real man? Because from where I'm standing, you look like exactly the kind of loser who needs to learn some respect for his betters." The workshop fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the soft whisper of sawdust settling on concrete. Even Mr. Peterson seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, though his civilian background left him unable to interpret the warning signs that screamed danger to anyone with military experience. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Students throughout the room found excuses to move closer, drawn by the primal fascination that surrounded impending violence like sharks circling blood in the water. Ethan continued arranging his tools as though Dylan hadn't spoken, his fingers moving with the kind of muscle memory that came from thousands of hours of practice. Each chisel, each measuring device, each cutting implement found its proper place with mathematical precision. But those watching closely might have noticed how he positioned certain tools within easy reach, how his body remained balanced despite his casual appearance, how his eyes tracked every movement in his peripheral vision without seeming to pay attention to anything at all. "You know what I think?" Dylan continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive as Ethan's lack of reaction fed his frustration. "I think you're one of those military brats who thinks Daddy's service makes him special. Problem is, Daddy's not here to protect you anymore, is he? Maybe it's time someone taught you how the real world works." Brandon Woods cracked his knuckles with theatrical emphasis, the sound echoing through the workshop like breaking bones. "Want me to handle this, Dylan? I can explain the social hierarchy in terms even a charity case can understand." His voice carried the kind of barely controlled violence that had made 3 previous students transfer schools rather than face his continued attention. Connor Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his engineering mind recognizing patterns that his social position prevented him from acknowledging openly. Something about Ethan's posture, about the way he moved through space, triggered warnings that Connor's privileged upbringing had never prepared him to interpret. The new student wasn't displaying the fear response that usually accompanied Dylan's intimidation tactics. Instead, he seemed almost relaxed, like a cat preparing to pounce rather than a mouse trapped in a corner. Jake Morrison had retrieved the staple gun from Dylan's workbench, testing its weight with the casual familiarity of someone who had used such tools for violence before. "This baby can put a staple through quarter-inch plywood like it was paper," he announced with obvious satisfaction. "Imagine what it could do to something softer, like expensive vintage clothing that doesn't belong in a place like this." Tyler Cross laughed at his friend's observation, though his eyes never left Ethan's face. "Yeah, some people need to learn that certain items aren't appropriate for school. Maybe we should help our new friend understand proper dress codes by making some adjustments to his wardrobe." The grandfather's jacket hung perfectly on Ethan's shoulders, its worn leather speaking of adventures across multiple continents and conflicts that had shaped the modern world. Hidden pockets contained documents that could topple governments and photographs that connected seemingly unrelated events across decades of political manipulation. But to Dylan's crew, it simply represented an opportunity to assert dominance through destruction of something obviously meaningful to their target. Mr. Peterson had become engrossed in explaining mortise and tenon joints to a group of students. On the far side of the room, his back turned to the confrontation building around Ethan's workstation. The positioning wasn't accidental. Teachers at Riverside had learned that seeing certain things meant paperwork and investigations that could threaten their employment. Willful blindness had become an institutional survival strategy that enabled the Carter family's continued reign of terror. "Here's what's going to happen," Dylan announced with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "You're going to apologize for thinking you belong in the same class as your betters. Then you're going to hand over that ridiculous jacket so we can make some improvements to its appearance. And if you're really lucky, we might let you keep most of your teeth." Ethan finally looked up from his tools, meeting Dylan's gaze with eyes that held depths the senator's son couldn't begin to comprehend. For just a moment, the mask of teenage vulnerability slipped, revealing something predatory and ancient that made Brandon Woods take an involuntary step backward. Then the moment passed, leaving Dylan wondering if he had imagined the flash of danger that seemed to emanate from the quiet transfer student like heat from a forge. "That's an interesting proposal," Ethan said softly, his voice carrying no trace of fear or anger. "But I think you should reconsider your approach." He gestured toward the staple gun in Jake's hands with casual indifference. Tools like that can be dangerous in inexperienced hands. People get hurt when they don't understand what they're playing with. The words hung in the air like a challenge, transforming the workshop from a place of learning into an arena where predator and prey roles were about to be decided through methods far older than civilization itself. Jake Morrison raised the staple gun with theatrical precision, his finger hovering over the trigger, as though he were about to fire the opening shot of a war that had been brewing for generations. The industrial tool gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lighting, its chrome surface reflecting the faces of students who had gathered to witness what they assumed would be another routine humiliation of someone foolish enough to challenge the established order. But none of them understood that Ethan Miller had been preparing for this moment his entire life, trained by a woman who had spent decades turning ordinary teenagers into instruments of justice that governments could never officially acknowledge. Rose Miller had been 17 when the CIA recruited her from a detention center in Detroit, pulled from a life of petty crime and channeled into something far more dangerous and infinitely more meaningful. She had spent her youth infiltrating drug cartels, extracting political prisoners, and eliminating threats that conventional military forces couldn't touch. By the time she turned 30, Rose had killed more people than most soldiers saw in their entire careers, always in service of protecting innocents who would never know her name or understand the sacrifices made on their behalf. The training had begun when Ethan turned 12, just old enough to understand that the world contained predators who wore expensive suits and friendly smiles. Rose had started with basic awareness exercises, teaching him to read body language and recognize threats before they materialized into violence. She showed him how to map exits in every room, how to identify improvised weapons in any environment, how to move through crowds without being noticed or remembered. These skills seemed like games to a young boy, elaborate forms of hide and seek, that made his grandmother smile with pride when he mastered each new technique. But the lessons had grown more serious after his parents died, when Rose finally told him the truth about the car accident that had stolen his family and left him alone. Except for a grandmother, most people assumed was just a harmless old woman living on Social Security. The accident hadn't been random. It had been assassination, carried out by professionals who understood exactly how to make murder look like misfortune. His father had discovered something during his deployment in Iraq, something involving a young senator named Richard Carter, who had been covering up war crimes that would have destroyed his political career before it truly began. Lieutenant Marcus Miller had been a good soldier, the kind of man who followed orders without question until those orders involved murdering civilians to protect political careers. He had photographed the execution of an entire family, documented the cover-up that followed, and planned to testify before a congressional committee that would have sent Senator Carter to prison for the rest of his life. Instead, Marcus and his wife died when their brake lines failed on a mountain road in Colorado, their car plunging into a ravine that ensured no investigation would reveal the truth about their deaths. Rose had kept the evidence her son died, protecting, storing photographs and documents in hidden compartments throughout their small apartment like a museum of unpunished crimes. She had shown Ethan everything on his 16th birthday, laying out the proof of his parents' murder with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent her life dealing in state secrets and official lies. The photographs were difficult to look at, images of Senator Carter standing over bodies that included children no older than Ethan himself. But Rose had insisted he understand exactly what kind of evil they were facing, exactly why his training had to continue despite the pain it caused them both. The tactical pen that lived in Ethan's jacket pocket had belonged to his grandfather, a CIA operative who had used it to eliminate 3 Soviet agents during the Cold War. Rose had modified it over the years, adding features that turned a simple writing instrument into something capable of killing a grown man in seconds. She taught Ethan to write with it every day, ensuring his muscle memory would allow him to deploy it as a weapon without conscious thought when survival demanded speed over contemplation. His grandfather's jacket contained more than just sentimental value or family photographs. Hidden within its lining were documents that could destroy Senator Carter's political career and send him to prison for crimes that had no statute of limitations. Bank records showing payments to assassination teams, correspondence with military contractors who specialized in making problems disappear, and most damning of all, a recorded confession from a dying soldier who had participated in the civilian executions under Carter's direct orders. Rose had spent 18 months teaching Ethan how to access these documents safely, how to authenticate them in ways that would stand up to legal scrutiny, and most importantly, how to stay alive long enough to see justice served. The training had evolved beyond simple self-defense into something approaching special operations preparation. She taught him to fight with improvised weapons, to disable opponents without killing them unless absolutely necessary, and to move through hostile environments with the kind of tactical awareness that kept intelligence operatives alive in foreign countries. The basement of their apartment building had become a makeshift training facility where Rose recreated scenarios Ethan might face when the Carter family finally learned he was alive and represented a threat to their carefully constructed empire of corruption. She taught him to fight in darkness, to use environmental advantages against multiple opponents, and to maintain operational security that would prevent enemies from anticipating his capabilities until it was too late for them to mount effective countermeasures. But perhaps most importantly, Rose had taught him to recognize the signs of systemic corruption that allowed families like the Carters to operate with impunity for decades. She showed him how money and political influence created networks of protection that insulated the guilty from consequences, how victims were silenced through intimidation and occasionally elimination, and how ordinary citizens became complicit through fear and willful ignorance of crimes committed in their names. Dylan Carter represented everything Rose had taught Ethan to recognize and eliminate. The senator's son had inherited more than just wealth and political connections. He had inherited a legacy of violence that stretched back to his father's war. Crimes and forward into a future where the next generation would continue perpetuating cycles of abuse unless someone finally stood up and said enough. The bullying at Riverside High wasn't random teenage cruelty. It was preparation for a life of wielding power over others, of using fear and violence to maintain control over anyone who threatened the established order. Ethan understood that today's confrontation wasn't really about stapling his shirt to a wall or destroying his grandfather's jacket. It was about whether evil would continue to flourish in another generation, protected by money and political influence while good people suffered in silence. His parents had died trying to expose the truth about Senator Carter's crimes. Rose had spent years preparing him to finish what they had started, to use the evidence they had died protecting in ways that would finally bring justice to victims who had waited far too long for someone to speak on their behalf. The workshop classroom had become a theater where multiple generations of conflict would finally reach resolution through methods that civilized society preferred to ignore. Every tool within reach could become a weapon in hands trained to see beyond their intended purposes. Every opponent showed weaknesses that proper training could exploit faster than consciousness could register threat and respond appropriately. The concrete floors would soon be marked with blood spilled in service of a justice that courts and politicians had failed to deliver. Jake Morrison's finger tightened on the staple gun trigger, his confidence absolute in the knowledge that Riverside High belonged to Dylan Carter and his crew in ways that transcended official authority. Teachers had learned not to see certain things, administrators had learned not to ask certain questions, and local police had learned that investigating complaints against the Carter family was a career-limiting decision that smart officers avoided whenever possible. But none of them had ever faced someone trained by Rose Miller, shaped by tragedy into an instrument of retribution that would finally balance scales weighted too long in favor of the guilty. The jacket that Dylan's crew intended to destroy contained enough evidence to topple governments and expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of American political power. More importantly, it contained the last connection Ethan had to parents who had died protecting strangers they would never meet, who had chosen truth over personal safety because some things were worth dying for. The industrial staple gun hummed with barely contained energy as Jake took careful aim at the vintage leather that had survived wars, covert operations, and 4 decades of careful preservation. His smile widened with anticipation of the destruction he was about to inflict, unaware that his weapon was about to become the catalyst for violence that would transform a quiet workshop classroom into a battlefield where the strong would finally protect the weak from predators who had operated with impunity for far too long. Rose had always told Ethan that evil flourished when good people remained silent, when ordinary citizens chose personal safety over moral obligation to protect others from systematic abuse. Today would be the day that silence ended, when one teenager armed with skills learned from a grandmother, who refused to let injustice continue unopposed, would demonstrate what happened when predators finally encountered someone trained to hunt them in return. The first staple fired with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the workshop like a gunshot, its trajectory aimed directly at the worn leather shoulder of Ethan's grandfather's jacket. But the space where the jacket had been a millisecond earlier was now empty air, and the industrial fastener embedded itself harmlessly in the brick wall behind Ethan's workstation with enough force to send chips of mortar scattering across the concrete floor. Ethan had moved with fluid precision that defied physics, his body flowing sideways and down in a motion that seemed to bend time itself around his movement. The maneuver wasn't possible for normal 17-year-old students, but Rose Miller had spent years teaching her grandson that impossible was simply another word for unprepared. His feet found perfect balance on the dusty floor as he completed the evasion, jacket intact and expression unchanged, as though dodging industrial projectiles was as natural as breathing. Jake Morrison stared at the empty space where his target had been, his brain struggling to process what his eyes had witnessed. The staple gun felt suddenly heavy in his hands, its chrome surface now seeming less like a weapon and more like evidence of his own inadequacy. Around the workshop, students had frozen in place, their adolescent minds unable to reconcile what they had just seen with their understanding of how confrontations were supposed to unfold in their carefully ordered world of privilege and predictable outcomes. Dylan Carter's face flushed red with a mixture of embarrassment and rage that transformed his handsome features into something ugly and primitive. He had orchestrated this moment for maximum humiliation, had positioned himself and his crew to deliver a lesson that would establish his dominance over the new student and reinforce the social hierarchy that kept him safely at the top. But instead of the cowering victim he expected, Dylan found himself facing someone who moved like liquid mercury and showed no trace of the fear that usually preceded his victories. "Lucky dodge, charity boy," Dylan snarled, his voice carrying the particular venom reserved for those who dared challenge his authority. "But luck runs out eventually, and when it does, you're going to learn what happens to people who think they're better than their betters." He gestured to Brandon Woods with sharp authority, sending his lieutenant into motion with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive practice in group violence. Brandon charged forward with the subtlety of a freight train, his massive frame cutting through the space between workbenches like a battering ram designed to crush anything unfortunate enough to stand in its path. His approach was everything Rose Miller had taught Ethan to expect from opponents who relied on size and intimidation rather than skill and intelligence. Brandon telegraphed his intentions with body language that might as well have been written in neon letters, his movements predictable to anyone trained to read the subtle signals that preceded violence. Ethan's response was economical and devastating in its simplicity. He stepped aside at the last possible moment, allowing Brandon's momentum to carry him past his target while simultaneously extending his leg at a precisely calculated angle. The larger student's ankles tangled with Ethan's positioning, and physics took over from there with merciless efficiency. Brandon's considerable mass became a liability as he crashed, face first into the industrial workbench that Ethan had abandoned moments before, his forehead connecting with the steel edge hard enough to produce a sound like a hammer striking meat. Blood began flowing immediately from the gash that opened across Brandon's scalp, the crimson liquid mixing with sawdust and metal shavings to create a grotesque paste that spread across the workbench surface. He groaned and tried to push himself upright, but the impact had scrambled his equilibrium enough that standing became a complex negotiation between his brain and his inner ear that would take several minutes to resolve successfully. Connor Hayes had witnessed enough playground fights to recognize when events were spiraling beyond normal parameters into territory that would require adult intervention and medical attention. His engineering mind calculated vectors and force distribution, arriving at conclusions that made his stomach clench with anxiety. This wasn't teenage posturing anymore. This was systematic dismantling of Dylan's crew by someone who understood. Violence in ways that suggested professional training rather than street experience. "Dylan, maybe we should back off," Connor said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of nervous tension that preceded panic attacks and emergency room visits. "This guy isn't what we thought he was. We need to get Brandon to the nurse and figure out what we're really dealing with here." His suggestion was reasonable and intelligent, which automatically made it unwelcome in a situation where Dylan's pride had been wounded and his reputation threatened. Tyler Cross and Jake Morrison flanked Ethan from opposite sides, their coordination improving as they learned from Brandon's mistake. They approached with more caution than their fallen teammate had displayed, but their strategy remained fundamentally flawed because they were operating from assumptions about their opponent that had already been proven incorrect. They expected a frightened teenager who had gotten lucky once and would crumble under sustained pressure from multiple attackers. Instead, they faced someone who had spent years learning to fight in scenarios specifically designed to overwhelm and confuse. Normal defensive responses. Rose Miller had taught Ethan to thrive in chaos, to use multiple opponents against each other through positioning and timing that turned their numerical advantage into a tactical liability. The workshop classroom provided an environment rich with improvised weapons and environmental hazards that could be exploited by someone with the proper training and mindset. Jake still held the staple gun, but his confidence in its effectiveness had been shaken by watching his first shot miss completely. He raised it again, this time trying to lead his target and compensate for the possibility of sudden movement. But Ethan had already identified the weapon as his primary threat and positioned himself accordingly, using the workshop's industrial equipment to create barriers that would complicate any attempt at ranged engagement. Tyler moved in from the left side, his hands reaching for Ethan's jacket with the intention of restraining him while Jake lined up another shot. But Rose Miller had spent countless hours teaching her grandson that grappling was often more dangerous than striking, especially when opponents outnumbered and outweighed the defender. She had shown him how to use an attacker's grip against them, how to convert attempted restraint into opportunities for devastating counterattacks that could end fights before they truly began. Ethan allowed Tyler's hands to make contact with the leather jacket, then pivoted his entire body in a direction that Tyler's brain hadn't anticipated. The motion twisted Tyler's wrists at angles that human joints weren't designed to accommodate, producing sharp pops that echoed through the workshop like bubble wrap being stepped on. Tyler's grip released involuntarily as pain receptors overrode his conscious intentions, and he stumbled backward, clutching his damaged wrists against his chest. The second staple fired while Tyler was still processing his injuries, but Ethan had used the grappling exchange to change his position relative to Jake's aim point. The industrial fastener whistled past his ear close enough that he could feel the displacement of air against his skin, embedding itself in a wooden cabinet. that housed the classroom safety equipment with enough force to penetrate completely through the inch-thick plywood construction. Jake's frustration mounted as he realized that his weapon was useless against an opponent who refused to remain stationary long enough to be targeted effectively. The staple gun had seemed like the perfect tool for humiliating someone by destroying their clothing, but it was proving inadequate for actual combat against someone who moved with the fluidity of water and the precision of a machine designed specifically for violence. Dylan's rage had evolved beyond embarrassment into something approaching genuine hatred as he watched his carefully planned intimidation session dissolve into a demonstration of his crew's inadequacy. He grabbed a wood-handled chisel from the nearest workbench, its blade sharp enough to shave curls from hardwood and certainly capable of inflicting serious injury on human flesh. The tool felt comfortable in his hands, its weight and balance familiar from years of shop classes that he had endured rather than enjoyed. "Enough games," Dylan announced, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that came from someone accustomed to winning through superior resources rather than superior skill. "You want to play hero? Let's see how heroic you feel when you're bleeding all over your precious jacket." He advanced with the chisel held low and ready, its blade catching the fluorescent lighting in ways that sent glittering reflections across the workshop walls. But Ethan's attention wasn't focused on Dylan's improvised weapon or the three remaining opponents, who were still capable of coordinated action. Instead, his eyes had locked onto something that had fallen from his jacket pocket during the grappling exchange with Tyler. A photograph lay face up on the concrete floor, its edges worn from years of careful handling, but its image still clear enough to be recognizable from across the room. The photograph showed two soldiers standing beside an Iraqi civilian family, their uniforms dusty from desert operations, and their expressions grim with the knowledge of what they had been ordered to do. One of the soldiers was clearly a younger version of Senator Richard Carter, his face bearing the same aristocratic features that his son had inherited, along with his capacity for cruelty. The other soldier was Lieutenant Marcus Miller, Ethan's father, who had risked everything to document what happened next. Dylan's eyes followed Ethan's gaze to the photograph, and his face went pale as recognition struck him like a physical blow. The chisel wavered in his grip as his brain processed implications that reached far beyond a simple school confrontation into territory that could destroy his family's political dynasty and send his father to prison for war crimes that had no statute of limitations. Connor Hayes had also seen the photograph, and his engineering background allowed him to recognize the significance of documentation that connected Dylan's father to events that contradicted everything the senator had claimed about his military service. The image was damning evidence of proximity to atrocities that could topple governments and reshape political landscapes if it ever reached the right investigators. The workshop fell silent except for Brandon's groaning and the hum of machinery that continued operating regardless of the human drama unfolding around it. Students throughout the room sensed that they were witnessing something that transcended typical school conflicts, something that would have consequences reaching far beyond detention or suspension into realms where adults faced serious legal jeopardy for decisions made years before their children were born. Jake Morrison slowly lowered the staple gun as understanding dawned that he was no longer participating in casual bullying, but had become an accessory to something that could destroy lives and careers if handled incorrectly. The simple plan to humiliate a transfer student had evolved into exposure of secrets that powerful people had killed to protect, secrets that made everyone in the room potential witnesses or potential targets, depending on how events unfolded in the next few minutes. The photograph lay between them like a bridge across decades of buried secrets, its faded colors speaking truths that powerful men had spent fortunes trying to erase from history. Dylan Carter stared at the image with growing horror as recognition dawned, his aristocratic features contorting into something primitive and desperate as the implications crashed over him like a Tsunami of political destruction. The chisel trembled in his white-knuckled grip as he processed what it meant that Marcus Miller's son was standing in front of him, alive and armed with evidence that could send Senator Richard Carter to federal prison for the rest of his natural life. The civilian family in the photograph had been executed 20 minutes after the image was captured, their bodies dumped in a mass grave that Carter's unit had dug while Miller documented everything with methodical precision. The senator's political career had been built on lies about his military service, campaign speeches about honor and sacrifice delivered to voters who never suspected their representative had murdered children in cold blood to protect, illegal arms deals that netted him millions in offshore accounts. Ethan watched Dylan's face cycle through denial, recognition, and finally the cold calculation that marked him as his father's son in ways that transcended mere genetics. The senator's boy had inherited more than just political instincts and aristocratic features. He had inherited the capacity for violence that came from understanding that some secrets were worth killing to protect, that witnesses needed to be eliminated before they could testify to congressional committees or grand juries, that still believed justice was possible in a system designed to protect the guilty. "Your father murdered my parents to keep that photograph secret," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent workshop with the weight of absolute certainty. 2 years ago, they were driving home from a lawyer's office where they had just signed affidavits detailing everything your father did in Iraq. Their brake lines were cut by professionals who made it look like an accident, because traffic fatalities don't require investigations that might expose inconvenient truths about war heroes. Dylan's laugh was high and brittle, the sound of someone whose worldview was crumbling in real time as reality intruded on carefully constructed fantasies about family honor and political legitimacy. "You're insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes kept darting back to the photograph that proved everything Ethan was saying. "My father is a decorated veteran who served his country with distinction. He would never hurt innocent people. Your father executed 7 civilians, including 3 children under the age of 10. Ethan continued with the clinical detachment Rose Miller had taught him to maintain when delivering uncomfortable truths to people who preferred comfortable lies. He sold weapons to insurgents who used them against American soldiers, then covered up his crimes by murdering the families who witnessed his transactions. My father photographed everything because he believed Americans deserved to know what was being done in their name." Connor Hayes had retrieved the photograph from the concrete floor, his hands shaking as he examined details that confirmed his worst fears about the powerful families who controlled Millbrook County through networks of corruption and mutual blackmail. The image quality was professional grade, shot with equipment that captured facial features and uniform insignia with forensic clarity that would satisfy any courtroom standard for evidence authentication. "This is impossible," Connor whispered, though his engineering background allowed him to recognize authentic documentation when he saw it. "Senator Carter has been advocating for veterans' rights for 15 years. He built the Memorial Park, funded the VA clinic expansion, supported every military family initiative that came before the legislature. Why would someone who committed war crimes spend his career helping veterans?" "Guilt makes people do strange things," Ethan replied, his attention split between monitoring Dylan's increasingly unstable emotional state and tracking the movements of the other crew members, who were beginning to understand that their casual bullying session had evolved into something that could destroy their families' carefully constructed reputations. Helping veterans publicly provides excellent cover for someone trying to hide the fact that he betrayed them privately. Every speech about honor and sacrifice becomes evidence of his patriotism rather than compensation for his crimes. Jake Morrison had slowly backed away from the confrontation, his tactical mind recognizing that possession of the staple gun made him a potential accessory to whatever violence was about to unfold. The industrial tool suddenly felt less like A weapon, and more like evidence that could link him to assault charges, or worse if events continued, escalating toward the kind of bloodshed that required police intervention and medical attention. His father's law firm handled civil litigation, not criminal defense, which meant Jake's family connections wouldn't protect him if he participated in covering up war crimes or murdering witnesses. Tyler Cross cradled his damaged wrists against his chest, but his attention remained focused on the photograph and its implications for everyone who had witnessed its revelation. Tyler's mother sat on the school board, and his stepfather was the county judge, positions that required maintaining public images of integrity and moral authority that would be destroyed if they were connected to covering up evidence of war crimes committed by their political allies. "We need to call the police," Tyler said through gritted teeth, pain and fear combining to override his loyalty to Dylan's crew. "This is way beyond anything we can handle ourselves. If that photograph is real, if Senator Carter really did those things, then we're all accessories to covering up federal crimes, just by being here when it was revealed." "Nobody's calling anyone," Dylan snarled, raising the chisel in a gesture that transformed him from entitled teenager into something approaching genuine menace. "This stays in this room until we figure out how to handle it properly. That photograph could be faked, digitally manipulated, created by political enemies trying to destroy my father's career through slander and fabricated evidence. The metadata can be verified," Connor said quietly, his technical knowledge making him invaluable to both sides of the increasingly volatile confrontation. "Digital forensics can authenticate when and where that image was captured, what equipment was used, whether it's been modified since creation. If it's real, trying to destroy it just makes everything worse by adding obstruction of justice to whatever other charges might follow." Brandon Woods had managed to regain his footing despite the head injury that continued bleeding steadily onto his football jersey, but his usual swagger had been replaced by the uncertain movements of someone whose brain was still struggling to process the impact that had temporarily scrambled his equilibrium. Blood loss and concussion symptoms made it difficult for him to follow the rapid-fire revelations about war crimes and political corruption, but he understood enough to recognize that his simple worldview of strong versus weak had been complicated by forces beyond his limited comprehension. "Dylan, maybe we should listen to Connor," Brandon said slowly, each word requiring conscious effort as he fought through the mental fog that accompanied traumatic brain injuries. "If your dad really did kill people, if the cops are going to find out anyway, maybe it's better if we cooperate instead of making ourselves look guilty by trying to cover things up." "Shut up," Dylan screamed, his composure finally cracking under the combined pressure of exposure and betrayal by his own crew members. "You don't understand anything. None of you understand what's at stake here. My father has worked too hard building his career to let it be destroyed by some dead soldiers' lies and fabricated evidence." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon, confirming everything Ethan had accused Senator Carter of doing while simultaneously revealing that Dylan had known about his father's crimes long before today's confrontation. The senator's son wasn't an innocent victim of circumstances beyond his control. He was a willing participant in a conspiracy that had already claimed multiple lives and would claim more if allowed to continue operating with impunity. "You knew," Ethan said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made several students take instinctive steps backward. "You've known all along what your father did in Iraq, what he did to my parents, what he's been doing to anyone who threatens to expose his crimes. That's why you've been terrorizing students at Riverside High. You're practicing for a lifetime of using fear and violence to silence anyone who might threaten your family's power." Rose Miller had taught her grandson to recognize the moment when negotiation became impossible, when opponents revealed themselves to be so fundamentally committed to evil that redemption was no longer a viable option. Dylan Carter had crossed that line when he admitted knowledge of his father's crimes, while simultaneously expressing determination to continue, covering them up through violence against witnesses and destruction of evidence. The workshop classroom had become a battlefield where 2 generations of conflict would finally reach resolution through methods that civilized society preferred to ignore, but circumstances sometimes made necessary. Every tool within reach could become a weapon in hands trained to see beyond their intended purposes. Every piece of equipment could be used to defend innocence or eliminate threats depending on which side possessed the superior training and moral clarity. Dillon advanced with the chisel held in a reverse grip that suggested some familiarity with edged weapons. His approach more cautious than his crew members had displayed, but still fundamentally flawed because he was operating from assumptions about combat that had been shaped by movies rather than actual training. He expected dramatic flourishes and prolonged exchanges that allowed for posturing and intimidation tactics designed to break his opponent's will before physical contact became necessary. Instead, he faced someone who had been taught to end fights as quickly and efficiently as possible, to minimize his own exposure to injury while maximizing the damage inflicted on opponents who had chosen violence over peaceful resolution. Rose Miller had shown Ethan that real combat was ugly and brief, decided by preparation and training rather than courage or desperation, won by whoever could deliver incapacitating strikes before their opponents realized the fight had actually begun. Ethan's response to Dillon's advance was a masterpiece of economy and precision that would have made his grandmother proud. He stepped inside the chisel's effective range faster than Dillon's nervous system could register the movement, his left hand deflecting the weapon while his right drove into Dillon's solar plexus with enough force to paralyze the diaphragm muscle that controlled breathing. The senator's son doubled over, gasping for air that his body refused to process, his face turning purple as oxygen deprivation triggered panic responses that overrode conscious thought. The chisel clattered across the concrete floor, its blade chipping against industrial equipment as it spun away from Dillon's nerveless fingers. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as his respiratory system slowly remembered how to function properly. The strike had been calculated to incapacitate without causing permanent damage, though the psychological impact would last considerably longer than the physical effects. "Your father's crimes don't have to become your legacy," Ethan said quietly, standing over Dillon's gasping form with the patience of someone who understood that violence was sometimes necessary but should never be the first option when dealing with opponents who might still be capable of redemption. "You can choose to testify against him, to help the victims get justice, to break the cycle of corruption that's poisoned your family for generations." But Dillon's response, when he finally recovered enough breath to speak, revealed the depth of corruption that had taken root in his character through years of watching his father escape consequences for increasingly serious crimes. "Never," he wheezed, glaring up at Ethan with hatred that transcended mere personal animosity into something approaching religious fanaticism. "I'll die before I betray my family. We're Carters. We don't kneel to people like you." Jake Morrison had been slowly moving toward the workshop's emergency alarm button, his movements subtle enough that he hoped to avoid attention while summoning adult intervention that might prevent the situation from escalating further toward genuine tragedy. But Ethan's peripheral vision caught the movement, and Rose Miller's training kicked in with automatic precision that had been conditioned through thousands of repetitions until response time approached the speed of thought itself. The tactical pen appeared in Ethan's hand as though materialized by stage magic, its matte black surface reflecting none of the harsh fluorescent lighting that illuminated the increasingly chaotic scene. Jake's hand was 6 inches from the alarm button when the pen struck his wrist with surgical precision, targeting pressure points that caused immediate, temporary paralysis without inflicting permanent damage to nerves or circulation. "Don't," Ethan said simply, his tone carrying the kind of absolute authority that made Jake freeze in place rather than attempting to complete his reach for the emergency signal. This needs to finish the way it started, without outside interference. From adults who have spent years pretending they don't see what happens in their own hallways. Connor Hayes had been calculating angles and force vectors throughout the confrontation, his engineering background allowing him to appreciate the precision and efficiency of Ethan's responses to each threat as it materialized. The new student wasn't fighting like an angry teenager losing control of his emotions. He was operating like a professional who had been trained to neutralize threats with minimal collateral damage while maintaining tactical awareness of multiple opponents and environmental hazards. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Connor asked, his scientific curiosity temporarily overriding his fear of becoming the next target in what was clearly a one-sided demonstration of superior combat skills. That's not something you pick up from martial arts classes or YouTube videos. That's military-level training, special operations stuff that takes years to develop properly. My grandmother taught me that evil flourishes when good people remain silent. Ethan replied, his attention still focused on Dylan, who was slowly recovering his ability to breathe normally, but showed no signs of abandoning his determination to protect his father's crimes through violence against witnesses. She taught me that sometimes silence makes you complicit in atrocities that could have been prevented if someone had possessed the courage to stand up and speak truth to power. The workshop door burst open with enough force to slam against the concrete wall, announcing the arrival of Mr. Peterson, who had finally noticed that his classroom had become suspiciously quiet during what should have been a productive work period, filled with the normal sounds of students engaging with industrial equipment under proper supervision. His expression cycled rapidly through confusion, concern, and growing alarm as he processed the scene that greeted him upon entering what he had assumed was a safely controlled educational environment. Brandon Woods sat propped against a workbench with blood streaming down his face from a scalp wound that would require professional medical attention to heal properly. Tyler Cross cradled obviously damaged wrists while tears of pain streamed down his cheeks. Jake Morrison stood frozen beside the emergency alarm with his right hand hanging useless at his side. Dylan Carter knelt on the concrete floor gasping for breath while a photograph lay nearby showing images that Mr. Peterson's military background allowed him to recognize as evidence of war crimes. "What in God's name is happening in my classroom?" Mr. Peterson demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had once commanded soldiers in combat zones where hesitation could mean death for everyone under his responsibility. His eyes swept the scene with tactical awareness that missed nothing, cataloging injuries and positioning while his brain calculated the best approach for de-escalating a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond normal parameters into territory requiring immediate intervention. But before anyone could answer his question, the lights went out with a finality that suggested deliberate action rather than accidental power failure, plunging the workshop into darkness broken only by emergency lighting that cast eerie red shadows across industrial equipment that suddenly seemed far more menacing than educational. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.